The sound comes first, a low, collective rumble that has no place in the vast quiet of the Libyan desert. It's the night of July 26, 1942. 18 American Jeeps, bristling with machine guns, are driving in formation, headlights off. Ahead, silhouetted against the faint starlight, are the shapes of German aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip on a forward airfield. But these men aren't trying to be quiet. Their plan is not to sneak in and plant explosives. Their plan is to drive straight down the runway and open fire. It looks like a suicide mission. But this wasn't an act of desperation. It was a calculated solution. This is the story of the Sidi Hanish raid, an attack that would become SAS legend. But separating the myth from the military reports reveals a more complex picture. How did a small, unarmored column penetrate a major Luftwaffe airfield, create chaos, and vanish into the desert? And crucially, why was this seemingly suicidal tactic born not from recklessness, but from the complete failure of the Special Air Service's original mission? By the summer of 1942, the war in North Africa had reached a crisis point for the Allies. Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps seemed unstoppable. In June, the fortress port of Tobruk had fallen, a devastating blow to British morale. Rommel was now pushing deep into Egypt, his panzers threatening the Suez Canal itself. Amidst this strategic chaos, a much smaller, more personal crisis was unfolding for the founder of the SAS, David Stirling. His unit had been created for one reason: to drop small teams by parachute deep behind enemy lines. But the theory had collided with the brutal reality of the desert. Their very first mission, Operation Squatter in November 1941, was a catastrophe. Dropped into a gale-force storm, his men were scattered, injured, or killed. Of the 55 who jumped, only 21 returned to friendly lines. The result of the raid? 0 enemy aircraft destroyed. The pattern repeated in subsequent missions. Parachuting into the vast, featureless terrain meant broken bones, lost equipment, and teams that could never regroup. Once on the ground, they were exposed, easily tracked, and hunted down. Back in Cairo, British High Command was losing patience. The SAS was seen as a costly, ineffective experiment, a private army for an eccentric officer, squandering precious aircraft and trained men for negligible results. The official sentiment was clear. The unit was on the verge of being disbanded. Stirling was fighting a war on two fronts, one against the Axis and another against the skepticism of his own command. With their founding doctrine a proven failure and their very existence hanging by a thread, the SAS had to either adapt or be erased from the order of battle. The answer would not come from the sky. It had to come from the ground. If they couldn't drop from the sky, they would have to drive. The inspiration came from another elite unit, the Long Range Desert Group, or LRDG. These were the undisputed masters of the deep desert, navigating the impassable sand seas with an almost mystical skill. The SAS began hitching rides with LRDG patrols, using them as a desert taxi service to get near their targets. But David Stirling envisioned something more, not a stealthy insertion, but a cavalry charge. The tool for this vision arrived with American aid, the Willys Jeep. Light, rugged, and mechanically simple, it was the perfect canvas. In desert workshops, SAS men began a radical transformation. They stripped off windshields and grills to reduce weight and glare. They welded on condensers to recycle precious radiator water. And then came the firepower. They mounted Vickers K machine guns, twin and even quadruple mounts. The Vickers K was an aircraft gun designed for aerial dogfights. Its blistering rate of fire, over 1,000 rounds per minute, was perfect not for a sustained battle, but for a devastating instantaneous volley. They had just invented the technical, a fast, long-range, mobile gun platform, a new weapon for a new kind of war. With the weapon and the tactic now proven, David Stirling needed a target worthy of the risk. It was found on the maps, the Luftwaffe Airfield at Sidi Hanish. This wasn't just another landing strip. It was a primary forward base for the Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft, the workhorses ferrying fuel, ammunition, and men to Rommel's front line. An attack here wouldn't just be symbolic. It would directly starve the Afrika Korps at the height of its advance. Command of the 18-jeep raiding column was given to Major Paddy Mayne, a former Irish and British Lions rugby international. Mayne was a man of violent contradictions, a published poet who was disciplined for brawling, yet an officer whose men followed him with absolute loyalty. In combat, his courage and ferocity were unquestioned. His plan for Sidi Hanish was as brutal and direct as his personality. The LRDG would guide them through the desert. They would drive onto the airfield in formation, and they would shoot it to pieces. On the evening of July 25, 1942, the column of 18 SAS Jeeps and their LRDG guide vehicles slipped out of their hideout and into the vast emptiness of the Libyan desert. This was the point of no return. Their route was a 100-mile arc, a deep flanking maneuver through enemy-held territory. Navigation was an art form, a combination of sun compass readings by day and celestial navigation by night. It was a 19th century skill applied to 20th century warfare. The journey itself was an enemy. The oppressive heat warped the air and threatened to boil the water in their radiators. Every jeep was a fragile machine, a potential breakdown that could compromise the entire mission. The greatest fear was the sky. A lone German spotter plane could doom them all. They drove dispersed, ready to scatter at a moment's notice, the men scanning the horizon not for enemy patrols, but for the glint of sun on a distant wing. Meanwhile, at Sidi Hanish, the evening routine was underway. The base was protected, but its security was oriented towards the predictable. Defenses were strongest along the coast, prepared for a naval bombardment or a commando landing from the sea. The thought of a significant ground attack from the deep south across the impassable Great Sand Sea was a logistical absurdity. No one could carry enough fuel and water for such a journey. German security was a line on a map, drawn along the coast. The desert behind them was considered a greater barrier than any minefield. This profound failure of imagination was the vulnerability the SAS was about to exploit. As dusk fell on July 26th, the SAS column arrived at its final lying-up position, a few miles south of the airfield. In the fading light, they could hear the faint drone of aircraft landing and taking off. The final preparations began. Fuel cans were topped off. Vickers guns were given a final check. Ammunition belts were loaded, with a high proportion of tracer rounds, not just to aim, but to set fire to canvas-skinned aircraft and ignite fuel tanks. Paddy Mayne gave his final briefing. The formation would be 2 columns of jeeps. They would drive slowly, side by side, down the rows of parked aircraft. No one was to fire until he fired the first shot from a very pistol. Darkness fell, thick and absolute. The column moved out, engines held to a low whisper. They found the perimeter fence, not near the heavily guarded main gate, but at an isolated, unguarded section. Wire cutters made a silent opening. They were inside. SAS memoirs, written years later, tell a story of a sentry seeing the unfamiliar shapes of the jeeps, but the familiar outline of the German-style steel helmets worn by the raiders, simply waving the column through. German records, however, show no report of such an encounter. It may be a myth, a legend born in the retelling of a great success. Or it may have been one tired guard's fatal mistake. The truth is likely lost to the desert sands. Fact or legend, the result was the same. The 18 jeeps drove past the perimeter and onto the edge of the main runway. They formed up, 2 perfect lines, engines ticking over. Ahead of them, parked in neat rows, were the dark, silent shapes of dozens of Luftwaffe bombers and transport planes. The element of surprise was total. The quiet hum of 18 idling engines was about to be replaced by the roar of nearly 200 machine guns. In the darkness, Paddy Mayne raised his hand. The time for stealth was over. But the legend of a clean sweep hides a harsher truth. Amid the chaos of the withdrawal, one man was lost, Corporal Ken Warburton. His death, however, wasn't at the hands of the enemy. In the darkness and confusion, he was tragically killed by a stray round from another SAS Jeep, a casualty of friendly fire. This messy reality extends to the numbers. The SAS after-action report, written to prove their value to a skeptical high command, claimed an astonishing 37 aircraft destroyed. German records, though incomplete, suggest a lower, though still significant figure, around 24 aircraft destroyed or severely damaged. But the argument over the exact number misses the point. The true measure of the raid's success wasn't in the contested body count of aircraft. It was in the few minutes of controlled chaos that proved a revolutionary idea. The green flare arched into the sky. 18 throttles slammed open in unison. The low hum erupted into a deafening, unmuffled roar as the jeeps surged forward in two parallel columns, accelerating straight down the neat lines of parked aircraft. Then the night exploded. The combined fire of over 30 Vickers K machine guns opened up a single, continuous, deafening torrent of sound. Every fourth round was a tracer, stitching the darkness with incandescent red lines. They weren't just aiming, they were painting with fire. The tracers, designed to be incendiary, ripped into the thin-skinned fuselages of the Junkers transport planes and Stuka dive bombers. For a few terrifying minutes, the SAS achieved total fire superiority. To the stunned German crews, it was an attack from an impossible direction, a naval bombardment coming from the heart of the desert. Before any coherent defense could be mounted, the raiders completed their run, wheeled around, and vanished back into the blackness, leaving a roaring inferno in their wake. That inferno at Sidi Hanish provided the definitive answer to the question that had plagued David Stirling. This wasn't a suicide mission, it was the solution. The raid proved, in fire and steel, that the Jeep-mounted lightning strike was not a desperate gamble, but a sustainable and brutally efficient doctrine. The age of high-risk, low-reward parachute drops was over. For the SAS, the era of the long-range desert raid had begun. This became their signature method, inflicting damage on Rommel's rear echelons that was far out of proportion to their numbers. The raid didn't just save a unit, it created a blueprint. The war in the desert was changed not by a new tank or a bigger bomb, but by an idea born of failure and mounted on the chassis of a simple American Jeep.